This episode of the Chris Johnston Show is brought to you by Sports Interaction. Sports Interaction is your homegrown sports book, where local takes on an entirely different meaning, focusing on the teams, games, and players that matter to you. Sports Interaction is on the ground, on top of all the local trends, and offering prop bets that you'd never even imagined existed, from same-game parlays to a best-in-class casino featuring thousands of games and live 24/7 dealers. And now introducing the Locker Room, the first of its kind in Canada, a live watch party for the biggest games of the week. Sports Interaction, your homegrown sportsbook. Go to sportsinteraction.com/SDPN to open an account. Bet local. 19 plus. Please play responsibly. And if you have questions or concerns about gambling or the gambling of someone close to you, please go to connexontario.ca.
I know that some in our audience know the finer points of hockey.
The Chris Johnston Show.
We are your friends.
The biggest stories, bringing you inside the game.
What did you hear?
Powered by Sports Interaction, your homegrown sportsbook. Always remember to bet local.
Here's Chris with your host, Julian McKenzie.
Part of the game.
Packed show for a Monday. A whole bunch of news and notes to get to. Joseph Woll out week to week. Cal Connor on the knee-on-knee. Really weird situation between Columbus and Florida over the weekend. John Tavares is about 2 points away from 1,000. There's a lot of these random news and notes we got to get to. We're getting Connor versus Connor this week. I'll give you your space to grieve over the baseball news over the weekend.
Ask grieving,
CJ
man.
well.
Cowboys just beat the Eagles.
Okay, we don't need to get into your NFL agenda.
There's no agenda. I'm just saying that it's Monday morning. That's the last thing that I saw Sunday night before putting my head on the pillow. I'm in a great mood. This is going to be an awesome week.
But CJ, this isn't the Athletic NFL show.
That's fine. The OGs that have been with us for a few years, they know that I'd be happy with a Cowboys win. I take a lot of shit for being a Cowboys fan. So on the good days, I'm just saying there's nothing to grieve. This is all butter. Everything's good.
Well, okay, that's a good way to cope from the other news I was trying to tease that happened this weekend, unless you really don't want to talk about it. Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, we can talk about it.
We'll talk about it. But first, we should talk about the Edmonton Oilers, a team that at the beginning of the year, we had a lot of high hopes for, and they had a terrible start to their year. They have since rebounded, winners of 7 in a row. They are level with the Calgary Flames on points, with the tied for 4th best in the Pacific, only a couple points off of a wild card playoff spot right now. I was just curious, what do you make of the Edmonton Oilers doing everything they can to salvage their year and make it into the playoffs? Just before New Year's, they look like a completely new team.
Yeah, I mean, they've almost completely erased, I guess, the hole that they dug themselves, wasn't just a hole. Was it like the Grand Canyon of holes that the Oilers were in, early in the season? And I don't know how to view this. Look, we talked with this team at the start of the year. I think we're both on the same page that certainly they were a cup contender, if not a favorite, depending on how you viewed it. I was just surprised to see them hit the depths they did within the first, 6 weeks of the season. I'm a little less surprised to see where they are now. And what a strange year of extremes already. For that organization. But I think that the high level takeaway from me, Julian, is that they can now just kind of play. Like, I realize they're not in a playoff position as of this minute, but that they're close enough touch of one that I think that they don't have to stress over every, 2-game losing streak that might come along. I think if they just do their thing, basically win somewhere close to 2 out of every 3 games, or, 3 out of every 5, maybe statistically, that they're probably going to be okay. And, the thing that jumps out the most, I mean, there's been a coaching change. Some other things have gone on, but, you're seeing Connor McDavid in particular just light the world on fire. I mean, at one point earlier in November, he was like 90th in league scoring. He jumped into the top 10 with like a monster week. And I'm not saying that he's single-handedly lifted them to all these wins, but certainly he's been a big driving force behind a lot of success for the Oilers, and him looking like himself again, I think, is most encouraging, because, we do know he was playing at less than 100% earlier in the season. And maybe, they did have a pretty big break in the schedule there. Actually, time for Connor McDavid to fly back to Toronto and take a spot on Canada's Walk of Fame in the middle of the season. And, you just wonder maybe if some of that time off has either refreshed his body or mind. But everything's cooking again in Edmonton.
And to your point about that time off, some teams above them in the standings right now, the St. Louis Blues, 2 points ahead of them, Arizona and Nashville in wildcard spots. Edmonton has a game in hand on Arizona. They have 3 games in hand on Nashville. They have 2 games in hand on St. Louis. That time off, I mean, they could make up some of that ground. And if they win some of those games and some of those other teams fall off, I'm telling you, like, this team could put itself back into a playoff position where we all expected they would be. It's a remarkable, like, first half season turnaround. I can't think of any other team that's done anything like that if they actually do this.
Well, they just plummeted basically straight to the bottom of the standings where no one ever thought they'd spend even one day, let alone a couple weeks. And then they've ripped right back up into the middle of the pack. And it won't surprise me if they just go and have the kind of regular season from this point on we would have expected them to have and make the playoffs comfortably. And we'll probably talk about how there were some positives about the way the season started. I mean, certainly nothing positive about having, a couple coaches fired behind the bench. But I just mean in terms of maybe bringing the group together that they really went through some things in the early going, and maybe they've found a way to pull themselves out of it. It's weird. I mean, sports are so strange in terms of how you end up in this spot. But I still think Edmonton is a team that will look for goaltending as time goes along. I mean, here's another factor, right? That it's just taking some heat off the idea that you have to make this move today just to make a move. That's sort of what I was saying even too. I don't think they need to be fixated on the standings just yet. You almost needed the 7-game win streak though to counterbalance how bad the start was, because remember at that time, everyone was doing that. They need to play at 106-point pace from here on in to just make the playoffs, all those sort of numbers. Well, now they don't have to do that. Now you've won 7 in a row. You almost just like throw everything out together. And you're like, okay, we're somewhere we want to be. And I think they can just go play. And the West is a weird conference again this year. Like there's a couple teams at the very bottom that look to be quite bad. I'm looking at Chicago. I know San Jose's won some games, but don't think it's going to be a great year there. I mean, Seattle's been a little puzzling in terms of just how far back they are. I just think there's lots of runway here for Edmonton to cruise into the playoffs, and then obviously they got to figure out how they're going to get through teams like LA or Vegas, who look like they're going to be strong once again as we get into the second half of the season soon.
You mentioned Chicago. Fascinating game tomorrow between the Chicago Blackhawks and the Edmonton Oilers. We get our first Connor versus Connor. We get Connor McDavid and Connor Bedard against each other. There's a good piece up on the Athletic website. Could Connor McDavid and Connor Bedard forge the NHL's next great rivalry? You should check that out. Mark Lazarus and Daniel Nugent-Bowman put that together. What do you make of Connor versus Connor? What do you make of that matchup, the superstar potential in both of those Connors playing against each other? I've said Connor a lot, by the way, the last few moments.
It's funny. I've covered a lot of these type of games in my career, and there's like certainly a lot of curiosity there, right? Like when you have 2 of the most supremely gifted offensive players on the ice in one game on opposite sides. I mean, it would be like going back in time and seeing a Gretzky versus Lemieux game or something of that nature. It's probably much cooler for Connor Bedard, if we're being honest, just because he grew up watching Connor McDavid. And, while he's had his first tour around the NHL here, he's, seen other stars, including Sidney Crosby and others, Austin Matthews, that he's played against already this year. I think there'll be something special about that. Whether or not this becomes a rivalry, I think the jury's out. I mean, we need to align like the moon and the stars where, we're talking about Chicago becoming a Stanley Cup contender in somewhere in the near-ish future and Edmonton remaining one. I'm not saying it won't happen. It's just right now, there's no rivalry between the teams. But I mean, that would be pretty cool, right? I mean, you're talking about you want to see like Magic and Bird in the final against each other, right? Or could have been Gretzky Lemieux. They never played in a final against each other, but stuff like that. That's sort of where those rivalries are made. I mean, the Crosby Ovechkin thing was a rivalry because they entered the league at the same time. Obviously, they almost took turns winning the major awards early in their careers, but then the Penguins and Capitals played 4 or 5 times in the playoffs and played game 7s against each other. They had dueling hat trick games with Crosby Ovechkin. That's what made that rivalry more than just a media created thing. I think that there was a genuine rivalry because the teams were standing in each other's way constantly. We don't have that today with the Oilers and Blackhawks entering this game. But that being said, I'm certainly not pouring cold water on it. I'll watch the game. I'm curious to see, how Bedard in particular plays, and it's just kind of cool. I mean, let's face it, you don't get talents like that on the ice together every single night in 2 games, and I'm sure it's one that Bedard will remember. It's funny. I went down to Pittsburgh and covered, I think, a couple times when McDavid first played Crosby. Like, man, the torch keeps getting passed, and I just keep sitting up here in the press box getting a little grayer.
I was waiting for one of those. One more thing just before we get to sports interaction, just on the topic of McDavid versus Bedard. How much do you think the NHL needs that type of rivalry, a player versus player dynamic? Like the Crosby Ovechkin years, a lot of people, especially those who listen to the show, grew up in that era watching the Penguins and the Capitals battle each other in the playoffs, the dueling hat tricks in the playoffs. Remember that. How much do you think the league needs a player versus player type of rivalry?
Well, I don't think it hurts, right? I mean, it gives you something. If you're just a casual, if you're just someone who doesn't follow one team every game, or you're not watching 3 or 4 or 10 games a week of the NHL, but you find out that game's on, like, I think it does draw casual eyeballs. I also feel like it can't really be forced, though, and that's where it's tricky. Like, hard for me to be critical of the league or anything like that because we don't necessarily have something of that nature in this moment. I mean, let's face it, some of the things that work against hockey are kind of obvious. The players are wearing helmets, like you don't get to see their expressions quite as much. So you don't, again, if you're just casual, if you're not digging in and reading, these great 1,500 word stories on sites like The Athletic, like you might not get to know all the stories behind the story. And I think basketball in some ways better lends itself to that. Obviously, just, the best basketball players are on the court for most, if not all, the game. There's just, so hockey, being a team sport, I think it's a little harder to play that up. But, I think that we should encourage individualism. I know we've been sort of consistent on that. So that doesn't always mean, player X versus player Y, but I mean, at least I think that we should play up some of the aspects of the game beyond just the game. And, something like this will fall together naturally at some point in time, though. I don't, it's hard to know where it's going to be, but, like, look at last year's Cup final, like Florida, Vegas, there's nothing between those cities that you could really amplify in a legitimate way. There's no individuals on the team where you're like, it's Aaron Ekblad versus Jack Eichel. Like, there was nothing. I mean, they obviously spent time on the ice against each other in that series. Don't get me wrong, but it's I don't think you can fake it. Crosby Ovechkin is probably the closest that I can think of in my years in the league, just because they ended up playing in the same division. Their teams were both, top teams for years and years and years. And so by virtue of the way that this playoff format works, they had to go through each other all the time. I think there's years there where Washington lost to Pittsburgh where they probably feel, had they got through that round, that they might have won a Stanley Cup sooner than they ultimately did. And that's the kind of rivalry, but I don't know how we can fake it unless we end up getting like, super teams in the NHL and players sort of taking advantage of their free agency and loading up like that. I'm not sure that we're ever going to have that fall into place just so. I think the biggest issue in Chicago right now, when I look at it, is they're a long way away from being a long way away. It feels like that's not on Connor Bedard. He's obviously done, an awesome job individually this season, playing with, not the strongest, teammates, facing tough competition. He still put up a lot of points and goals. We just need the team around him to get better as soon as possible. Cause it might, he might be the rare generational player that's got to wait a few years to play a playoff game. I mean, typically we've seen, the Penguins missed the playoffs in Crosby's first year and then made it for 16 years in a row after that before missing again last year. The Leafs got in with Matthews right away. They had other young players and a better supporting cast. McDavid, I think it was a couple years, but then, Edmonton's been a regular playoff team most of his career. It's going to be an uphill climb there, I think, for the Blackhawks, even with having Connor Bedard, just because they're starting from way back in the pack.
Isn't that all the more reason to hype up these regular season games, though?
Yeah, man, I'm all for the hype. Yeah. Sorry, I feel like maybe I didn't bring the hype man to this segment enough. I'm just thinking, like, it's just kind of a curiosity to me. I don't know how much it really matters in the grand scheme of things, but if they both get hat tricks on Tuesday night, we're
That's all
probably
we're
still
going to
going
talk about.
we're going to want to talk about this on Thursday again, right? So, I mean, let's cheer for that. I'm not cheering for any team or even any individual in that game, but it would be great to see them both put on a show. I mean, that would be fun.
All right. Let's get to David Bastel for Sports Interaction, and then we'll get to the other side of the CJ show. Welcome to You Can Bet That. Remember to hit up sportsinteraction.com/SDPN for all of your gaming needs. CJ, it's not too early to look at the President's Trophy possibilities on Sports Interaction's website. The New York Rangers have the best odds at plus 425. The Kings at 5-1, trailing behind them. The Bruins, Avalanche, and Stars round out our top 5. What say you for this year's President's Trophy?
Well, where are the Golden Knights? That's the first thought that's coming to my mind here.
Golden Knights are tied on the same odds as the Dallas Stars at plus 750.
There you go. I mean, they've had such a strong start to the year and winning a cup last year. And you know, when I look at these things, it's always like, okay, who's incentivized to win? Who's going to be pushed to win? Who's going to prioritize this? I mean, I think it's fair if you're in Vegas right now and you've already got a Stanley Cup hanging around the ice, it's fair to say when we get into February, March, April, maybe they won't be pushing for a President's Trophy. Hard to know for sure. But, you know, I'm kind of inclined to lean towards Vegas. I mean, the Rangers have had a strong start to the year. Is that a hot take?
I mean, just considering that the Rangers are good. The Kings have been really good this year.
Well, all the teams are good. I mean, come on. We're talking about the top of the league right now.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, like, well, you know what? I'll say this. The Vegas Golden Knights have been slept on. They did have that hot start. They've kind of faded a little bit. So I don't know. I mean, no, I don't think it's that far-fetched. I'll give you that.
But you know, going back to the original point, and it's the one thing it's hard to answer is who's going to care about this enough to push it through and to play hard, even, you know, because all these teams in the mix you just mentioned, they're all probably clinching a playoff spot in early to mid-March, and they're going to have a little bit of garbage time at the end of the year, just in terms of games that don't really matter in a huge way in the standings for them. And so it's hard to put my finger on that, but I'm leaning towards Vegas. I don't know. I'm in a Vegas frame of mind today.
I guess it's the fact that they currently lead the league as we're recording this in points, and it is extremely difficult to be the number one team wire to wire. We saw Boston try to do that last year. I mean, they did for the regular season. Didn't work out for them in the playoffs. But at the end of the day, we're doing this for President's Trophy odds and not necessarily for Stanley Cup. So, hey, maybe you could take the Vegas Golden Knights at plus 750, again, tied with the Dallas Stars on odds. You can get the full list on the Sports Interaction website. Don't forget to check out sportsinteraction.com/SDPN for all the best odds before game, in game, and the best props. sportsinteraction.com/SDPN. Busy weekend in the NHL. Some injuries to talk about. Which story is a little bit more? It's kind of weird to talk about it with injuries, but which one do you want to start with first? There's Kyle Connor, who takes the knee-on-knee against the Anaheim Ducks. I believe he should be evaluated today. Joseph Woll gets hurt in Toronto. He should be out week to week. We have a little bit more with that, but which of these two injury stories should we start with first?
Well, we'll start with Connor. It's the most recent, fresh in mind, the game Sunday night in Anaheim. Takes that knee from Ryan Strome, and, you know, there's no good way to sugarcoat this. I mean, the Jets have had a better than expected for most start to the season. Kyle Connor's just filled the net with goals and is a huge part of their offense. And while we don't have exact clarification of the extent of his, you know, presumed knee injury here, you know, it doesn't look good. I mean, he's taken off the ice immediately. He doesn't return to the game. We've seen those kind of hits happen in hockey and often with sort of devastating outcomes in terms of long-term absences. And so I've got no reason to believe it's not going to be something that isn't going to keep Connor on the shelf for some period of time here. And that, you know, that's tough for a team like Winnipeg. I mean, he is their preeminent goal scorer. And, you know, that's been a huge part of the success early in the season. I'm not out here saying they can't withstand it. They do have a pretty deep set of lines. I think that's one of the positives of this particular Jets team is they can, you know, roll out 4 pretty strong lines and grind out wins that way. And obviously having Connor Hellebuck in net, you know, pretty good blue line. I mean, this is a good team, but, you know, you lose your best player. It doesn't look or feel too good, I don't think, on this Monday morning if you're around the Jets.
Do you think the hit from Ryan Strome is suspendable?
I think it is. It's not to say he will be as of this moment. There's been no clarification yet from NHL player safety. They had a pretty busy weekend, Julian. I don't know if you were keeping track. It felt like every couple hours there was a new hearing being announced, including one that's going to be an in-person hearing with David Perron, meaning he can be suspended more than 5 games. There's also an Eric Branson situation that George Parros and his staff are dealing with. And so I don't know if there's a timing issue there, but certainly I think the way that hit goes down is it's just a bad hit or a bad collision, knee on knee. Ryan Strome's ejected from that game, and it wouldn't at all surprise me if we're talking about some form or degree of supplemental discipline coming his way in the wake of this.
Yeah. Let's hold the thought on the weekend that player safety had, because you're right. The David Perron getting called up. Eric Branson, we're going to mention that as well. Just want to mention Joseph Woll, as he will be out week to week with a high ankle sprain. Seemed like it was a pretty tough deal for him to get that, because it seemed like he was playing really well over the weekend.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, he was the game in Ottawa where he got injured. It was his 5th straight start for the Leafs. He clearly taking control of the crease. That might have been his best NHL game to that point. Toronto was under siege for parts of the night, and he'd made several sort of highlight reel saves. He'd stopped 29 of 31 shots, and they were into the third period with the lead. And it's the most innocent looking shot of them all is where he gets injured. He was just sort of trying to push off, and something didn't go right with his ankle. It's been told to me, Julian, by players in the past that like you'd almost rather break something than have a high ankle sprain. I think that just the level of discomfort that comes with it, even when you're quote unquote healthy, like a lot of players have told me over the years that they never feel quite right with their ankle, even once it's sort of back to a spot where they can skate and compete. I'm sure a goalie somewhere has had this injury, but I don't remember it. It's sort of unusual, but given the movements of a goaltender, you just wonder how this is going to play out. I think the Leafs, they're not being deceptive with the injury timeline. I think they truly don't know. Week to week just means don't expect them back anytime soon, but we don't know if it's 4 weeks or 8 weeks, or somewhere in the middle of those two potential outcomes. And so, it's a tough blow for Woll, because I think he really was taking flight in the Leafs crease. I think that this is, if you're looking for a positive, is the fact the Leafs do have Martin Jones as their number 3 goaltender. I think that brings with it some comfort. It helps too that Ilya Samsonov in his first game after Woll's injured has a shutout on the weekend against Nashville. And so, he's been looking for traction on his season. Perhaps this is the moment, because obviously I think, as long as things go okay for him, he's going to get the majority of the starts moving forward. But the Leafs have a busy December schedule here leading into the holiday break. And so they're going to need both guys. And I do think there's some benefit to having, a goaltender in Martin Jones, who you're not counting on him to steal you games, but he's played over 400 in the NHL, won a lot of games in Seattle last year. I think there's comfort in that. And remember, they put a sneaky clause in his contract whereby on the day that they plan to put him on waivers at the end of training camp, he was owed $100,000 bonus the next day. And that was, meant to be a disincentive for other teams to claim him on waivers. Ultimately, no one did. And I'm sure in the front office of the Leafs, they're feeling happy that was the outcome, because, this might be a little tougher if you're dealing with a struggling Ilya Samsonov and maybe a younger goaltender from the AHL coming in as his backup in this situation. I think having Jones there is going to be a benefit as Joseph Woll recovers and gets back to the Toronto net.
You mentioned Nashville. Tyson Barrie getting the opportunity to play over the weekend. What's the latest with him and the trade request and everything that's kind of swirling around him?
Yeah, it was a crazy week for him. And, I had a chance actually to speak to him a little bit on Saturday morning in Toronto when the Predators were visiting. And I think the one thing that hasn't changed is he'd like a fresh start or like somewhere else to be. As we've talked about in prior shows, it's not always easy to make those trades at this point in time, because Nashville, can't retain salary on him or is unwilling to retain salary on him because they already have 2 players like that. So that would restrict them for the rest of the year from being able to do that in other deals. And I think, you probably don't want to box yourself in that way in the front office. So, the reality is he and they have to kind of make this work for the time being. I mean, we're only a little bit more than a week away from the holiday roster freeze, which runs from late night December 19th through to December 28th, the morning there. And so, I think it's entirely possible that the Tyson Barrie is going to be in Nashville for the next few weeks at minimum. But he was scratched for 3 games out of 4 a week ago, and he hadn't endured scratches since really he was just first breaking into the league in Colorado more than a decade ago. And so I don't think the fit is quite there with him and the Predators. I mean, obviously you're on a team with Roman Josi, power play minutes and sort of offensive minded minutes for a defenseman there's going to be less opportunity because he's going to be naturally soaking those up. Remember the Predators went out and signed Luke Shen, another right shot this year. So that sort of has added to their depth, and they feel they have 8 NHL defensemen right now. They're almost basically doing a rotation. They actually sat Shen out for a game on Sunday in Montreal. And so they've been sort of rotating players in and out. And I would imagine Tyson Barrie will probably be rotated in and out in the meantime. But, he's in the final year of a contract. I think that there's certainly teams that feel that he could help them. But, with a $4.5 million cap hit there, I think ideally he'd like to end up somewhere with a chance to chase a playoff spot or win. But, more than anything, I think he wants to play and his minutes and opportunities just haven't been there in Nashville. And, what's funny, Julian, when that trade was made last year, Matthias Ekholm went to Edmonton, I think the Predators were pretty happy with what they got from Tyson Barrie down the stretch. That seemed to be a good fit. It's just more with some of the additions they've made, maybe a change in the coaching staff, and the fact that Tyson Barrie hasn't performed up to, the level that they expect of him. He's kind of found himself lost in the shuffle here. And so, yeah, I think it's kind of awkward because everything's spilled out publicly. He comes through Toronto. There's a scrum started by me, with reporters. But you're sitting there. You've got to talk about it publicly. Like it's just not the most comfortable thing. Now, the one thing Tyson did say though, he said, "I'm not the first player to go through this, and I won't be the last." And that's certainly the truth. I think the outcome that he and they want is a trade, but the truth is that trade might still take some time.
I feel like I'm putting you through a speed round right now with the
amount
of topics we're coming up. This is good. Jesse Puljujarvi signing a PTO in Pittsburgh. What say you?
Well, look, the latest player coming back from a significant hip procedure. In Jesse Puljujarvi's case, he had the resurfacing done on both sides of his hip after last season. We're talking about a former 4th overall pick who's had hip trouble, who's been a bit of a polarizing player, I think, from his time, especially in Edmonton, where he showed himself to be a very good forechecker. Always produced strong underlying numbers, didn't produce, the counting stats you want to see in terms of goals and assists. And, being a 4th overall pick, just by virtue of that, a lot is expected of you. He was in that draft, remember, with Laine Matthews, Pierre-Luc Dubois at the top, like that. A lot of those players became pretty impactful players right out of the gate in the markets they went to, and maybe success has not been there for Puljujarvi. But I like the fit. I mean, Pittsburgh has lost Brian Rust here in the last week or so to an injury. They're scuffling a bit in the standings. I think if you look up and down their lineup, there's maybe a lack of depth there. And, they bring him in on a PTO so they can get a look at him, have him practice as he did over the weekend. There's no commitment to a contract just yet, and see if there's a, an opportunity where he might play. But from Puljujarvi's end of it, if you are healthy and if you earn a contract, I mean, he could literally find himself playing with Sidney Crosby in the near future. So I think that the opportunity there is pretty evident for him. And, I feel like we're like in this new precipice. Like, can these guys with hip surgeries, I know we've talked about a bit, like, can they come back? Can they be impactful? One that I actually forgot to mention in our last episode is Brad Marchand came off a hip procedure before last season, missed some time at the start of the year, but obviously he's continued to be a top player. Patrick Kane just scored his first goal in Detroit after signing there over the weekend. And now you have Puljujarvi trying to work his way back. And so, I do think a lot of advancements have been made in this regard. And obviously for Puljujarvi, if he's able to move around the ice and get his mobility back, being such a big man, being a strong forechecker, I mean, there's no reason that can't work with other offensive players. If you're someone who's going in there and helping them get the puck back, allowing their offensive skills to do what they will. I mean, I could see him being an effective player. I don't know where we're going to see him, but in talking to people around him in the last few months, I know he's worked very hard on his recovery. He actually got operated on by the same surgeon as Patrick Kane. And so, just sort of see how things play out in Pittsburgh. But I can understand why he chose to go there, because I do think they have a need for wingers and maybe not an abundance of cap space to make a trade, but they might be able to squeeze Puljujarvi in, and could be a win-win situation for the team and the player.
Okay, now we get to the action around player safety. Eric Goodbranson will have a phone hearing after his back and forth with Nick Cousins, which I gotta say, for the hit that Nick put on Eric before the incident, I believe they're putting in question here, really bad hit. Like I just need that said, because I don't know how that goes off the way that it does. And then Eric Goodbranson is the one getting called to the carpet. And then you have David Perron in Detroit, who will have an in-person hearing after his incident with Arton Zub of the Ottawa Senators. Obviously, that game had a scary moment with Dylan Larkin too. Like that was a bit of a tough watch. But what did you make of the busy weekend for the NHL's Department of Player Safety?
Yeah, no one's in the holiday spirit, right? I mean, what's with all this? It feels like the temperature got turned up on the games around the weekend, which, let's face it, it's an emotional sport. We don't like seeing players injured or those crossing the line, but some of the best hockey is intense hockey. A number of hits sort of from behind, like the Cousins hit on Goodbranson, I'd say we saw in various games that were played. Obviously, Goodbranson took matters into his own hands and was down for a few seconds there and then came up swinging. He's a hard-nosed player. Don't have any problem really with him wanting to defend himself in that manner. I guess the issue is he clearly instigated that fight. Would be hard to argue that he didn't with the way. I mean, I guess he would argue I instigated the fight after he threw a dirty hit on me in the corner. And so, this is what we get into, the blame game. Whose fault is it? But, I think ultimately if Goodbranson ends up with a game or two suspension for him, it might be sort of money well spent or time well spent, because, I think he's sending a message that he's not going to take that sort of thing lying down. I can understand why. The Perron issue is a little more nuanced, in that, really scary. You're right. You can understand what Perron sees in the moment. He sees his captain out cold on the ice, his feet faced in opposite directions. Like you can tell he's in a bad spot. He sees Artem Zub standing beside him, and I'm presuming didn't know what had happened other than, he assumed the worst. And what do we talk about all the time? Defending your teammates, defending your captain, in this case, probably defending your best player for Detroit or one of your best players. But you also can't get away with cross-checking people in the head. Like there's no debate. The debate here is that he's getting a phone hearing, right? Or sorry, an in-person hearing rather. Yes. So the debate is, that means that's teeing up the possibility of a pretty significant suspension. And you're talking about a player who's played 1,200 NHL games, never previously been suspended or fined, I don't believe. It's very similar. If you remember a couple of years ago, Jason Spezza had a long NHL career, never been suspended or fined. He initially got a 6-game suspension, for kind of a knee to Neil Pionk's head a little bit. Pionk was in an awkward spot, and I think Spezza was responding to a hit that Pionk had laid on Rasmus Sandin at the time, an injured Sandin, and he got a 6-game suspension out of the box. It was later reduced to 5 games on appeal. But that's the only kind of equivalent. It's not the same action is delivered by Perron, but it's very out of character for David Perron. I mean, we have years and years and years of examples of him not crossing the line. And in the case where he did, it's pretty clear. We don't need to hear his explanation to know what his explanation is. It's clear what he was doing, but at the same time, Zub was defenseless, didn't actually do anything in this case, and took a pretty vicious cross check to the neck area or the side of the head, which is a dangerous play. So, we'll have to see the outcome of that. Just because you get it, I should mention, just because you get an in-person hearing doesn't mean it will be 6 or 7 or 10 games, but it gives George Parros the opportunity or the ability to give out something that's significant. And, ultimately, if it ends up 6 games, for example, or more, he has the right to appeal to a neutral arbitrator. It doesn't just go to Gary Bettman as other appeals do for some shorter suspensions. So, it would be quite a statement for it to end up being 6 games or more. We'll have to see what happens there, but really tough play. And I'm with you. It's just scary seeing Larkin on the ice. And I'm sure that's exactly what Perron felt in that moment and wanted to come to the defense of his, good intentions, just not a very great outcome for the way everything played out there.
Absolutely. 2 more quick things before we get to Ask CJ. The Toronto Maple Leafs playing against the New York Islanders later today. John Tavares, 2 points away from 1,000 in his NHL career. I love what we were talking about him just before we started recording today. With all the accomplishments and accolades and his career performance to this point in his career, wouldn't it be something if he gets to the 1,000-point mark against the team that drafted him? He had spent so much time playing for and given them as much success as he could give them. But of course, we know how the end played out with him joining the Toronto Maple Leafs. How fun would that be if John Tavares got point 1,000 tonight against the New York Islanders?
Well, it'd be pretty poetic. You know, I was at that game, the first game back in Long Island at Nassau Coliseum at the time after Tavares had signed with the Leafs. I have never, ever in my life seen anything quite like that. You know, I don't know if you ever got to Nassau Coliseum, but quite
Never
literally there's the Long Island Marriott, there's a huge parking lot, and then the building. Like you're basically, when you go there to cover games and back in the day, you're just looking at the arena and a giant parking lot. And that parking lot was full 7 or 8 hours before the game. There were people with Tavares sweaters on, like, that they were running over or spitting on, stomping on while they were pre-gaming. You know, you remember the snake getting thrown on the ice and
Yes.
just the vitriol, and, you know, whatever. That's what's done is done. But it just, like, I've never been in something quite as hostile as that. And Tavares, to his credit, honestly handled it about as well as you could. I mean, he basically took his lumps, so to speak. He had to do a lot of media around that game, as you'd imagine, and just you know, always just been a super professional guy. But you have to know somewhere inside him, as he's preparing for this game, that it would be poetic and nice for him to get it. I don't know if he's going to get 2 points, obviously, to hit 1,000, but there would be something about that would be kind of interesting bookends. And you know, we'll just have to see how it plays out. I mean, the Leafs play the Rangers on Tuesday in New York, so they, you know, he's clearly going to hit this milestone, you know, in the next few days or within the next week, I would think. And so, you know, he's got an opportunity to do something not a lot of players would in Long Island. And it's not just a guy who left a team. It's a guy who left a team and took a lot of crap to do so, and now has, you know, at least a chance to put a cherry on top. I'm sure he'd probably just hope that the Leafs get 2 points in the standings more than the 2 points individually. But the two things they don't have to be mutually exclusive. They can go together, right? You know, and you look back on 2009, Tavares has more than 100 goals than any other player in that draft. He's got a couple hundred more points than any player in that draft. You know, really the only debate, if you'd want to have one, is Victor Hedman was taken second by the Tampa Bay Lightning. Probably, you know, it's, you know, you can't just measure the success by points straight up, but he's been by far the best offensive player from that draft. Maybe somebody would say you want the minute munching defenseman instead of, you know, if you went back and did a redraft 14, 15 years later. But either way, I don't think either team made out too badly in at the top end of that 09 draft. And Tavares can have a chance to remind the Islanders of what he once was and what he still is, if he can maybe get that milestone on their own ice.
As someone who always roots for the story, I am rooting for that story. Speaking of stories, let's get to the painful one before we get to Ask CJ here. Shohei Ohtani joining the Los Angeles Dodgers. You know the contract details. You may have also seen some of the discourse that has gone on online about how facts were taken in and some of the rumors that were flying around. Shame on you for getting into that story of the plane traveling from Anaheim to Toronto and having fun with that. Shame on you for feeling away and thinking that Shohei was in Toronto when he was in Southern California the whole time. Shame, shame, shame. Feels like I've seen a lot of that over the last few days. I don't necessarily agree with it. What do you make of this entire Shohei Ohtani debacle?
It's so multi-layered for me because, you know, I'm a big Jays fan. I was getting excited just from being a fan of the team about it, but, you know, also by nature of the profession you and I have, and my role specifically is to do something like John Morosi did. And obviously he was out in front of this story reporting things that just were proven to be completely false. And so I feel sick for him. I know John a little bit socially. You know, he's been around the NHL a little bit with work he's done for the NHL Network. You know, super nice guy. Obviously, he got bad info or made a mistake. I mean, I don't ultimately know what happened there, but that is, as a reporter, that is your worst nightmare. I mean, you never want to be wrong, but there's a degree of wrong, and then there's flat out wrong. And then in this case, there's just such a big story. I have to be honest. I went and bought a bunch of Jays tickets on Friday in anticipation of Ohtani starting. Now, in my case, I always knew nothing's done until it's done, and I like going to games anyway, so I'm not upset about that. But I do wonder, how many people went and spent a lot of money on opening day tickets or something on the secondary market and all that kind of thing. What's done is done. Like, sounds weird because I am a fan, but like, I also look at this guy's life. He can go sign wherever he wants, but it was just a shitstorm really all around. I mean, the fact that you had a good, 8 or 10 hours of anticipation on Friday where people were literally thinking like he's about to sign in Toronto. He's on this plane. Then John reports he's on, again, I'm not trying to pile on Morosi here. I think anyone who followed the story closely understands his role in amping up the excitement around it. And I don't know if it was a case where the Jays were used purely as leverage. I don't know if someone misunderstood something or lied to him. Like it's so hard to know. Like I'm not behind the scenes, but I just know, occasionally reporting on stories kind of as big as that one, or that have a lot of people paying attention. Like there's no room to be wrong, frankly. And unfortunately in this case he was. And I think that almost makes it worse for Jays fans. I mean, had he just signed with the Dodgers, some Jays fans would be disappointed, but I think there was a real growing expectation that he was about to sign in Toronto, and it didn't happen. It's going to be interesting when the Dodgers actually visit the Jays in late April. So I don't know if people will boo Ohtani. Like I don't know how to feel about that. Like it's his choice, and really anyone being upset, I guess you would only be upset if you really believe him or his agents did something to sort of play to extra play with the hearts of Jays fans and to screw them to make another $100 million. I mean, I don't know where I land on that, but the contract is eye popping. I mean, $200 million more basically than we've seen for any other North American professional sports athlete to get on a deal. So, I mean, that's, he had leverage, but I think the leverage was used well in negotiations, and just a crappy story all around. But I'm hoping we're going to get Cody Bellinger here at the Jays, or maybe some other signings. And then those tickets I bought will not be, I won't be sitting there going like, oh man, why did I spend all this money on tickets thinking I'd be watching Ohtani, and I'm seeing some other version of this team.
You still have a good team, man. Guys like Kevin Gausman, Vladdy, Bo Bichette. Like, this is still a good team.
Exactly. It was more specifically that I bought like tickets to each of the first 3 games. Like, there's just no world I would ever go to those first 3 games. But I mean, whatever. Good problem to have. Maybe I'll give a pair to a friend or something. Like, it's not there's no animosity my way that way. But I'm sure some people, like, who knows? Like because he really thought I thought he was signing here. I did. I allowed myself to believe.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I actually feel bad for you guys. Like, I generally thought he was going to sign. And then it felt like after it was revealed he wasn't in Toronto the whole time, like the wind kind of came out the sails, and this emotional letdown came through. I generally feel bad for you guys. And I get it. Like, Cody Bellinger could sign, but like, you already see people online saying, I don't want to go through this again. Wonder if he's going to sign and all that. Like,
well, he actually is in Toronto. If you look at his girlfriend's Instagram, and it's verified, it's her. She posted yesterday pictures of the skyline and whatnot. So like, he doesn't mean he's signing here. I mean, he's a free agent. He can visit, once upon a time, Matt Duchene went and visited Montreal and didn't sign with the Canadians, for example. And there's other examples of that. I'm just saying of the ones I can remember off the top of my head. Like, just because he's here doesn't mean he's signing, but the chances, there's at least, you're saying there's a chance, there's a real chance. Whereas like Ohtani, I don't know how real the chance was. In the end of the day, like he never got on a plane to Toronto. I don't know how that all got misconstrued, but he went to the complex in Dunedin, but that's 6 weeks of spring training. He was never sizing up the city that he was going to actually live in for several months.
Thank you for braving through such a tough topic, CJ. Let's get through some of these questions quickly for Ask CJ. Let's start with Rory. Hey, CJ, do you have a sleeper team to be a seller at the trade deadline?
Oh, it's a little early.
Yes, we made that clear last week, and we're still getting questions.
Well, no, and I respect the question. Rory. I just don't know who counts as a sleeper team. Like, you look at the standings right now. You've got Philadelphia having a stronger than expected year. Washington's in a playoff spot as of this moment. But I could see those teams end up being sellers. Obviously, we got the Flyers well represented on the trade board. That's up at the Athletic. I just don't have the answer. Honestly, I don't have the answer yet. I need to see a bit more. And, I certainly think that any team, though, that's on the line or out of the playoff picture by the end of February will consider being a seller. There's a lot of reason to do so. But I don't see it being like any of the top teams, which is probably what you meant by sleeper teams. Like if I came out and was like, well, I think the Leafs are going to be a seller or something like that, you'd be like, whoa, well, to be clear, they will not be a seller. But I don't see any of the absolute sort of cup favorite type of teams. I don't see Edmonton being a seller almost under any circumstances, for example. But don't worry, we're going to keep giving you all the trade talk you need on these future episodes.
Oh, we definitely will. From K-Town 2272, what do you think the Vancouver Canucks would be looking for in return for Andrei Kuzmenko?
Well, I still think they wouldn't mind bolstering the D a little bit, and that comes even after the Nikita Zadorov trade, of course. But most teams would, want more depth back there that are preparing for a long playoff run. I'm not certain that they're going to move Kuzmenko by any stretch, but you can't miss the fact he's been sat out for a couple games. His ice time is down. Obviously his production is down, and it's only signed for one more year. So if you're another team that maybe feels that you can offer him the sort of role that brought him success last season, and that, it makes sense that you would at least explore that with the Canucks. And, the Canucks are of a mind where they're looking to clear cap space all the time, right? That's been a consistent theme there. They've managed to do it a little bit. We had the Anthony Beauvillier trade. I would think if they get to a position where they're going to move Kuzmenko, that they might look for another forward back too, just because, you're already down Beauvillier. If you remove Kuzmenko there, I mean, you're maybe thinning things out a little bit up front, but I don't think there's a trade the Canucks have to make, but it's certainly a situation to continue to monitor, especially if Kuzmenko isn't able to get a little more traction with that coaching staff.
Okay. From Mike_S412. CJ, as a big golf fan, how do you feel about the golf ball rollback, both for pros and amateurs?
I don't have a strong opinion on this one. I think as long as the pros are on an even playing field, I've got no problem with it. Look, part of it is like some of the most famous golf courses in the world are like 80, 100 years old or even older. And if technology has made some of the hazards that were put on those courses just meaningless because guys can hit the ball so far, and one of the reasons they're hitting it so far is the technology, I can understand the desire to try to restrict that technology because, you can't just forever be building new golf courses for players to play on that are getting longer and longer and longer. When it comes for the average, weekend player, I don't. Problem is golf balls don't last forever. But I'd say I have no problem with them having juiced up golf balls. Like if it makes the game more fun, for the average person just playing with their buddies or their dad or whatever. I mean, I'd say just have at it. I don't care if you break any rules. I don't care if you carry 15 clubs in your bag, even though there's a restriction on PGA Tour players. I don't care. I think anything that makes the game enjoyable, if you're not competing for money or competing professionally, have at it. But certainly for the pros, I can understand the desire to do it. I just hope there's a way to make sure everyone's on an even playing field and that there's not ways to cheat within that. And I don't know how they're going to enforce all that because this is still a couple of years down the road.
And that's going to do it for today's edition of the Chris Johnston Show. Be sure to subscribe to the SDPN YouTube page and to our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We are everywhere you want to listen to podcasts. We'll be back on Thursday with a brand new episode. For CJ, I'm Julian. So long and peace.
The Chris Johnston Show.
Powered by Sports Interaction, your homegrown sportsbook. Always remember to bet local.
Inside the game twice a week. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris and follow Julian McKenzie @JK McKenzie.
The Chris Johnston Show.